Well, I'm going to hand it over to Sri and just let you get started.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. My name is Sreekar Gadde. I am the Executive Director at Blue Tree Allied Angels. Eventually, my partner, Jason, is going to come join. We both do, outside of our Blue Tree work, helping startups understand kind of what is IP, what are patents, why should you get them, why shouldn't you get them. And so one of the big things that we've seen in talking to startups, especially early on, was this thought process that you needed a patent to get funding. And so just get a patent. And that causes issues later on, especially if you talk to investors later on who understand something of the patent process and the IP process in general. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but what we really wanted to do is start talking to entrepreneurs earlier in the stage to start thinking more strategically about why they're getting patents and why they're getting IP, to stop it from being a $50,000 concrete shoe and more of a lifeline to keep your business up and running. And so we'll just jump into that. Good. So here's the biggest point of this entire talk, is that IP doesn't drive value. Business value drives IP. And what I mean by that is that every decision when you're talking about IP and every decision when you're talking about patents should be made in view of what type of business return you're going to get on it. Jason and I often talk about, if you're going to get a patent, it's going to cost you $50,000. Are you getting $250,000 of value out of it? Do you have a direct sight line to that? Because if not, you're wasting $50,000.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Sorry I'm late. I'm Jason. It's nice to meet everybody. But yeah, we'll continue, I guess.
And so, go ahead.
Yeah, so large companies use their patent strategy in order to drive their business objectives. And so one of the things that we did in this presentation, we brought out this chart. The number one objective for most large corporations is to make sure that their IP strategy is aligned with their business strategy. And we also firmly believe that the same sort of logic should apply to small companies as well. So if you're building a new startup, you should be thinking strategically about where you put your resources into your intellectual property, why you're doing it, and why you're obtaining patents or other forms of protection, and using that to drive your business strategy. And so in particular, make sure that the IP assets that you're acquiring are actually going to generate an ROI for your company. So we're going to talk through a few more things today. We're going to talk about how patents can essentially weigh down your company. Because if you have a poor patent strategy, as Sri mentioned, it's very easy to spend inordinate amounts of money on your portfolio. And if those patents aren't going to deliver business value for you, it could sink your company, and you could be wasting both time and money that you could be spending on your product, on your sales and marketing efforts, and other sorts of things that will drive return on investment for your company. But patents can also be a lifeline to your company. So there are ways to monetize and drive value from your portfolio, and we're going to talk about ways that you can do that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about making informed decisions. How do you figure out when and whether to go after patents or to use other forms of protection?
And for this to be most effective for all of you, please ask us questions as we're going through this. It'll be easier to address things as we go through it, rather than holding off everything to the end and trying to remember what all we talked about.
Yeah, so we'll talk about how can patents actually sink your business. Recently, I was speaking to someone who built and successfully exited a company, and he talked about how their initial investors wanted to go out and get patents, and so they spent months writing and disclosing and working with their patent attorneys and tens of thousands of dollars. It turns out that they didn't really have something that was potentially patentable. It cost them, again, tens of thousands of dollars plus the effort, and they could have been using those resources on something else. So useless patents are a waste of valuable resources. And so you want to make sure that your patents are actually doing something for you, because they're costly to obtain. If they're not drafted well, it's going to limit your protection. And so the scope of your claims aren't going to actually prevent someone else from doing what you're doing. You also have to remember that patents are territorial, so if you obtain a patent in the United States, it doesn't help you anywhere else in the world. And so you need to consider where you're doing business, where your suppliers are doing business, where your competitors are doing business, and make sure that you have coverage that adequately protects you. And also, there are many ways that a patent can be invalidated, from prior art that wasn't discovered before, or prior sales, or other efforts that you may be doing on behalf of your own company, and so you need to be cognizant of the prior art rules.
And so, beyond just wasting valuable resources, there's the actual other effect of this, that patents can actually hurt your business value, even beyond the valuable capital that they use to get them. So for example, we talk about joint ownership without a single voice. What do we mean here is, let's assume someone comes to you and says, we want to develop technology with you, and we want to jointly own it. That sounds great. Maybe they're even going to fund it. Here's the problem. Now, either of you can license that technology, which means that if I'm someone who wants access to that technology, I'll go first to Jason and say, I'll pay you $50,000 for that technology. Then I'll go to you, I'll say, I'll pay you 45, 40. You'll just keep playing them off each other. Unless you guys are talking and have a negotiation about how those rights are going to be handled, it's very easy to play the owners, the joint owners of the IP assets against each other.
And on the flip side of that, the rules are different outside the United States in most jurisdictions. So, for example, if you have a jointly owned patent in Europe or in many other countries, you can't enforce or license without everyone being on board. So you would need all owners to agree to a license. So it's the flip problem of what happens in the United States, where in the United States, a joint owner can individually license their interest. In many cases abroad, you can't. So it's important that if you do get into joint development agreements or jointly develop technologies, that you think about how that's going to work going forward and make sure that you have agreements in place that allow for that.
Then that's always assuming you know who actually owns the patent. Now here's the question, when a developer, especially when a founder of a company files for a patent, oftentimes the company hasn't actually even been incorporated at that point. So how do you get these assets into the company? How do you make sure it's been properly assigned? Because you could very well be negotiating over an asset that you don't actually own. The third one is probably one of the biggest things. If you're not thinking strategically about what's going into the patent and what's being maintained as a trade secret, the thing you have to remember is everything that you write in a patent is publicly disclosed. The patent is a public document. So as soon as you have written it up and filed it at the patent office and gotten your patent or gotten it published, it is now out there for the world to see. Which means oftentimes, in this room I'll talk about AI. You might talk about the building blocks of an artificial intelligent machine. And then you might actually talk about the algorithms underneath it that you use to train up the machine. You might talk about the data that you use. All of that, which would have normally been trade secret and very hard to figure out, you've just published to the world. So unless you're really thinking strategically about where and what you want to publish to the world and what you need to publish to the world in order to get a patent, you can actually hurt your business by giving away some of your most valuable secrets that you can't actually protect in a patent, or at least enforce in a patentable context.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to that end, the last point, you can showcase your competitive advantage, so you can essentially be telling your competitors exactly what you're doing. And if you didn't draft the claims properly and they can't get through prosecution, all of a sudden you have a publication that anyone can go ahead and practice the technology that's in it.
Sorry about that.
So on the flip side of it, though, patents can encourage relationships and can encourage innovation. So one thing that we briefly touched on before is joint ventures. And typically in a joint venture, each company or each group contributes technology or something of value together in the development process. And they're able to expand on the resources together. And patent rights can be a key consideration. So oftentimes in joint ventures, you'll see two companies that have their own technologies, they're working on bringing them together to build something new. It can be a key incentive for a joint venture partner to actually agree to come in and work with you. But then again, care should be taken in forming these relationships to make sure that each party at the end has access to what they want and they're able to derive value from the relationship. Go ahead.
And again, as you've heard us talk about throughout this presentation, all of this has to be done thoughtfully about what's your strategy. And here what I mean is, oftentimes there's a question about who's going to own the asset at the end of this, who's going to be owning it, who's going to be licensing it. A lot of times companies think of this more on ego. I'm the bigger company, so I should own it, or something along those lines. I have more market power, so I'm the one that should own it. Ownership should really be thought of as who's going to take the responsibility of going out and protecting those rights, keeping the IP asset, if it's a patent, keeping it pending in front of the patent office, thinking strategically about the value, building up a patent portfolio around it, and then later on, who's going to be in charge of enforcing it, policing that no one else is infringing it, who's going to take those responsibilities on. That is who typically you're going to want to say is owning the patent, because the responsibility falls on that owner, and you want someone who's strategically, or who is incentivized to actually follow through with that.
And even if you're not the party that's ultimately controlling prosecution or controlling enforcement, you need to make sure that in those agreements, which can be relatively complex, that again, that you have the right to do what you want to do and that you're able to monetize and receive value for what you're doing.
And before we jump much further, are there any questions about the earlier piece, the concrete shoes, how patents or IP can really hurt your business, and now joint ventures and how we can start talking about how it helps your business?
Yeah, specifically when you had the AI example, that kind of resonated with me because we developed medical device, just mostly hardware side. This is the first time we actually have machine learning algorithms, and I didn't even know you can patent it, but I'm not sure what the strategy should be, especially since we're working with UPMC, PIN, they own the data, but we're going to be developing the algorithms, we're going to own the device. How does that work?
So, and this is a kind of a deeper project, but in the end, for everyone in the room, it's a strategic thought. What is publicly visible to competitors? Because the only thing that you're going to be able to use a patent to enforce for is what's publicly visible. Courts won't give you the ability to go fishing into other people's code. So you may not want to talk about specific algorithmic code in the patent. On the flip side, maybe it is that eventually you're going to have to release the code to the public anyways, because you're going to have to generate some sort of public understanding of what's going on, or white papers to generate trust that what you're doing is correct. If that's going to happen eventually, maybe putting in a patent is the correct thing to do, because what is or isn't patentable today, it may or may not be the same as what is or isn't patentable 5 years from now. So even though someone might tell you something is or isn't patentable now, the answer is going to change over time. The other thing in that example is you are under, I would assume, especially in joint ventures, you're going to be under obligations through the joint venture of protecting your partner's trade secrets. Without knowing what that is, you need to think strategically about what you put into a patent. And likely you want to run this by the other side. And you want them to run everything by you to make sure that they're not exposing anything that might be better maintained as a trade secret, might be their own personal data, might have HIPAA compliance issues. There's all sorts of other issues that play into what should or shouldn't be in a patent. The key piece is to think about everything strategically, then think about it over the long term, over 20 years, not over what is or isn't patentable today, what I need in the next 2 years, but what I want this asset to be worth over the 20-year time span.
Thank you.
Yeah, and are you a researcher at Carnegie Mellon, or are you
No, I have my own company.
Okay. Well, so the other side of that is that if you're working with UPMC, there's the whole academic research aspect to it, and make sure that you're aware of what their needs are and what they're going to be required to do, and work with either their Office of Research contracts or your tech transfer office and make sure you know what they need to, and make sure that you can figure out a way to get what it's going to be going for.
Thank you.
We'll keep moving forward.
Do you have a question?
Well, my comment may be a little bit on that line.
Yeah.
There's many in this room who have startup companies through university, through CMU, through PITS Innovation Institute. Many of us started at ground zero with an idea, and we either licensed technology directly from the university, or we got funded research through grants and whatnot, and angel investors to research. And then when something gets patented to the university, they have ownership of it in many cases. And I know there's a lot of details. That may even be another lecture. topic, but
Yeah.
specifically with universities, when a company invests funding and money and capital into working with the university to either license or develop, and
Right.
how does the company retain that equity and ownership of that, especially if they engage with other companies? Like if I'm working with a medical device and there's a lot of IP around it,
Right.
and I go to J&J or Medtronic or I go to
Right.
Zimmer and I say, this is what I got, but they really see the more value in my IP portfolio. How much leverage do I have to, especially in consideration with the university?
Right.
What do I have to sell? Do I have anything that I can legally sell, or does the university own that and there's restrictions to that?
Well, I think it depends on exactly what you're doing. I see Reed in the front row, so he may have some comments on this too, but I think it depends on exactly what you're doing. So is this a situation where the IP was developed in the university and then you're licensing it out from them? Or is this a situation where your company is funding research at the university and then you're like hoping to like take what comes out of that research relationship and move forward? So like, is this like federally funded research that was at the university, or is it something you're funding?
And I'll be really brief. I think it's more like, I think the intention of licensing with the university is to apply that IP and those patents to develop a product to commercialize.
Right. Okay.
But what I'm finding personally, and I'm not going to get into all the details, is that when I approach a company with this idea around a product for a clinical application, they're more interested in gobbling up all the IP, but I don't think it's mine to sell. Even if I funded it, even if the university researched it and filed for the patent, they have ownership of that. Or
that's predominantly right. So what your understanding is correct. You typically can't, like, you can't assign or license the technology that's been developed at the university because you don't own it. And typically, from my experience, most university licensing agreements don't allow you to assign without permission of the university.
You can sub-license it, right?
Sub-licensing rights can be part of a university license agreement.
Yeah, I guess it's all
if I get anything wrong, just step.
I guess it's all negotiable.
So far.
Yeah. In the end, it's a strategic question. First, know what you own.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what you have to clarify first.
And in this case,
know
you won't
what you can
own,
do with it.
You don't own it. Probably it's the
Well,
university that owns it.
you might own a license to it. You may or may not own the ability to sub-license it out. Make sure you know what your agreement with the university actually entails for any, and that actually applies to any sort of licensing deal or purchase of IP.
Right.
Know what it is that you have, then you can understand what you have leverage to negotiate with a potential acquirer.
And how long the longevity of those patents are. If it's, I mean, 20 years for a patent, right? If you're engaging with the university and they only have 4 years left, that's not a lot of time.
It can be a lot, or it can be a little.
On, like how far, like where the product is in its commercial lifetime, and if it's about to go to market and it's a blockbuster, like if it's a drug and it's a blockbuster, and you're looking at potentially billions of dollars in top line revenue.
And especially in this room, understand that yes, you've licensed some IP from the university, and there is a licensing agreement with that. You've likely developed other IP around that IP as you've built your company up. Along with that, you might have filed for more patents, or you may not have. You might have more trade secrets. There's a lot in IP that you can think about and think strategically around. So don't get too hung up on any one thing or other thing. Just understand what your rights are, and then think strategically about what you can do with it.
Thank you.
If I could offer a little more nuance there. So universities are nonprofit entities and regulated by the IRS as nonprofits, which controls what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. We're not allowed to do what's called work for hire, meaning we do work and you own it. If it's in tax-exempt bond finance buildings, most university buildings are tax-exempt bond finance buildings. So that means even when you fund something and something's invented by a university employee, the university owns it, and through your funding agreement, you will have a first right to negotiate a license to that. Even though you funded it, the university still has to get fair market value when it transfers that asset from the nonprofit to the for-profit. So even though you already paid for the research, you again have to pay fair market value for the license as if you hadn't even funded the research.
But you can transfer that exclusive licensing to a third party through the university if it comes to that type of a business?
So
Arrangement.
typically, the default agreement will say that you don't have the right to assign that license without permission.
Okay,
Right.
But sometimes that section is edited to say you do have the right to assign it in the context of an acquisition of your company.
okay.
But what often happens when there's an acquisition, the acquiring company will come in and say, we don't want this royalty stream for the next 10 years. What will it cost for us to just buy out that obligation for the future? And they pay a one-time thing instead of literally taking over the license as is.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So along those lines, cross-licensing is another avenue where patents can be very useful to your company. If you build up a patent portfolio that's well-drafted and covers your technology, it allows you to work with other companies that have technology rights that you need in order to be able to practice your technology. And if you don't have a set of patent rights that are useful to the other side, it may be difficult to engage in a licensing deal to get that technology. So oftentimes companies will go out and build their own portfolio specifically for this purpose. So some examples of this, Google and Samsung have a ton of patents that are related to the Android OS that they cross-license to each other. And then more generally, there's worlds of patent pools where there's multi-party portfolios where companies agree to put their patents together, and then all the parties to that pool have access and right of use for that technology.
So when you're thinking about lifelines for what patents specifically or IP in general provide to you, this is more of an earlier lifeline than you might think. So a lot of people think about patents as ways to sue people to stop them from doing what I've patented, which is true. It's a right to exclude. The problem is for most startups, a patent lawsuit costs $3.5 million, and there's no guarantee you're going to win. So it's not something that most startups can do. Cross-licensing, on the other hand, is something that most startups can do. You need access to some technology, someone else needs access to yours. There's a lot more ability to negotiate this earlier in the life cycle of a startup company. So a lot of value in a lot of the IP early on happens to be in licensing, cross-licensing, other types of ways to change how the company appears and what the company has, as opposed to bringing in the hammer to try to attack people.
Right, and to be clear though, cross-licensing deals have certain pitfalls as well. They might be administratively burdensome to administer just from making sure all the money gets distributed properly if there are licensing deals out of the pool. They can also be a barrier to entry because you need to have enough technology that is of interest to the rest of the parties in the pool. And also, they might receive regulatory scrutiny from an antitrust perspective. It's typically less of an issue in the United States, but it might be more of an issue in places like Europe. And patents can also be a way to encourage your customers to purchase from you, because if you own a patent, you have the right to exclude others from using or selling, and if they buy it from you, then it's an authorized sale, and they're able to use the technology and use the products that incorporate the patents that you have that cover your products. They can also be a key indicator of quality, just if only that the technology has crossed some threshold of being both new and non-obvious to someone who's of ordinary skill in the art of that technology. They can provide some assurance that your technology won't become obsolete due to a competitor, because again, you can prevent other competitors from building upon your technology. And also it can, as I mentioned, and I touched on first off, it can reduce the risk of patent infringement to the end customers, because if they have an authorized product for you in a sale, there's not going to be considerations of getting sued for patent infringement for using patent technology. So also, defensive portfolios and strategies can be key bargaining chips in negotiations. So it can be a bargaining chip if you're threatened with a patent infringement suit, that, which is sort of on the flip side of cross-licensing deals. So if someone is potentially looking at suing your startup as an infringer of their technology, if you have a patent portfolio that can be enforced against their products, it can be a way to bring the other side to the negotiating table to settle, or to ultimately get a settlement with a cross-licensing deal. Again, it might lead to better terms, opportunity to cross-license, and also may be available as counterclaims again if the competitor actually does initiate litigation against you. And also it might prevent them from obtaining exclusivity.
And these last two slides have really been more about how do you strategically think about your patent on mergers and acquisitions phase. So a lot of startups are not going to get to the point where they're either going to sue people or really market heavily on the patents or create defensive portfolios to try to fight off a lawsuit. More likely than not, though, when a potential acquirer comes to look at you, that's what they're going to be looking for is, why did you get the patent? What's your current strategy on developing the portfolio around that technology, whether it's patents, trade secrets, trademarks? What's the value of that in terms of negotiating power with other competitors in the marketplace? Those are where you can kind of really start to use your IP and your IP strategy to drive value for your business.
And so patents can also be a way of helping you raise money with angel investors or venture capitalists. There's academic research out there on this particular subject, and one study found that there was a 59% increase in the probability of raising venture funding after your first patent has been approved and issued by the patent office, which is pretty substantial. And so there very well may be more of a correlation than a causation issue here. But it is something that a lot of venture capitalists will want to see in your company. If you're in a industry or vertical or have a product, your patents are important. So if you have a new pharmaceutical drug that you're developing, your patent portfolio is going to be key. If you have a device or physical product that works in a new manner, your patent portfolio probably will be key. It's a manufacturing process. Those are places where it's going to be important to have a patent portfolio if you're looking to raise money, because it's probably going to be the first thing out of your investor's mouth.
But we will reiterate, this does not mean go out and patent.
Right.
Just for the sake of getting funding.
Make sure you understand why you're doing it. And I think the biggest key that if everybody walks out of here today, don't go out to get patents just because you think you should go out and get a patent. Know why you're doing it and what purpose it serves. So if your purpose is to raise money, understand why your venture capitalists want you to have patents in your business, what they cover, and what they're going to do to raise the value of your company.
Because remember, raising money is only a means to an end. You're using that money to build the company. If you're wasting more money on getting the patents than you're able to raise, it's a net negative for you to go after that strategy. So think really about how do these patents actually increase the value of the company over the next 3, 5, 7 years, along with how they're going to make fundraising easier.
Right. So for example, if you're getting a patent just because there are venture capitalists that want to see patents in your company and that's all they care about, and you don't think that the patent's actually going to be able to provide you with meaningful protection to prevent competitors from coming in, or you don't think that there's going to be a real opportunity for cross-licensing or developing outside licensing revenue, don't go out and spend $50,000 or $100,000 prosecuting and appealing decisions from the patent office. Go out and get something that's narrow, get something on paper, have it issue, and have your portfolio. But on the flip side of this, if your technology is something where your patents are really going to be able to provide you a competitive advantage by excluding others, that would be the other end of the spectrum, where you want to make sure that you spend money, have a very well-drafted set of claims in your issued patents.
And you've heard us throw out the number 50 to 100,000, and those of you who have looked into the patenting system and started getting a patent, you'll think we're relatively insane with that number, given that most of the quotes you're getting for filing a patent are between, let's say, 9 and 12,000. But the number we're talking about is not the amount of money you spend up front. It is what you pay for getting a provisional. It is what you pay for converting that to a non-provisional. It is what you pay for the next 5 to 7 years of prosecuting it through the patent office. It is what you pay for the next 15 to 20 years of maintenance fees to keep it alive at the patent office.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different fees that come
appealing
with
to the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, appealing to other courts, or filing outside the United States. Because every time you go to a new country, it basically will add another complete set of fees that are going to be roughly equivalent to filing domestically. So it can get very expensive very quickly, which is, again, what I'm driving on this point. Make sure you know why you're getting a patent, and then make sure that you're getting value from the money, the time and effort that you're spending in getting that portfolio. Another study talked about how early stage startups, especially those that are founded by first-time or inexperienced founders, patents can be a bigger key in helping you obtain venture capital financing. So it's more likely that if you are a first-time founder and you have a patent portfolio, it's another touchstone of an indication of quality of what you're doing and helping you get credibility with your investors.
It's also a pretty clear document you can hand to investors and say, this is what we've done. A lot of earlier stage and first-time founders have sometimes a difficulty of getting out of the weeds of what they've developed and get back to where the investors are at their high school level education in the technology that you're talking about. A patent really lets you start thinking about, how do I describe this to a jury? How do I describe this to a judge who doesn't know anything about my technology? Once you've gone through that process, talking then to investors, partners, other people becomes a little bit easier.
And further to that point, the other big thing that patents do, because again, as Sri mentioned earlier, patents publish, and they're going to put your technology and everything you describe in your patent application out for the public to see. The flip side of that is it does mitigate the information friction between you and your investors. So most venture capitalists will not sign NDAs because they see too many new companies that are pitching similar sorts of ideas, and they're not going to get themselves entangled in the possibility of getting sued on a non-disclosure agreement. If you have a patent application, you can freely talk about what you're doing and tell them about what you're doing without having to worry about someone potentially using your technology, again, assuming that your patent's valid and that it covers, it's broad enough to cover your competitors. But it also helps startups on path success. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about this particular study was that it found that it doubled your chance of possibly getting to an IPO, which again is a very small percentage of startups, but it's sort of another indication that if you're developing a patent portfolio and you're thinking about growing to be a large enough company to potentially get to that point, patents are one way to help you get there. So again, just to kind of like go through this, a lot of times venture capital funds look at patents as a way of de-risking their investment. And when it comes to exits, patents tend to drive value on exit, at least from a correlation perspective. And the caveat here again is it's important to know what the venture capitalists that you're working with or you're looking to receive funding from, what do they care about? Because if you're working in a consumer software play that's, you're working with venture capitalists that don't care about seeing patents in your company, don't spend too much time on it. But if you're working in something on the other end of the spectrum, you're developing a new drug that's got to go through phase FDA clinical trials and get regulatory approval all over the world, your patent portfolio is going to be key. So make sure you know which end of that spectrum you're in, and then make sure that you're building your portfolio in a way that aligns with that.
And the key is to why is that the key? And the reason in technologies where you're going to get acquired, why are patents so much more valuable than in other technologies, consumer goods, is at some point during the acquisition process, someone's going to make a decision on whether they're acquiring you for the cash flow that your sales are bringing in, that your product is bringing in, or are they acquiring you because they can use the technology you've developed to help build on their current technology and their current landscape to take this even further. So for those companies where they're going to take your technology more so than your cash flow to try to really scale up or ramp up what you're doing. So think of a Google or a Facebook. Why would they buy a company? Because they want to incorporate that technology into their platform. Where that's going to be the play, they're going to be looking, they're not going to be so worried about what your cash flow, what your sales are. They're going to be really worried about what your IP is, how well that you can protect that. What's your barriers to entry for other people following them? How can they leverage that IP to really help them grow their other products?
Another point to think about if you're looking for funding from the government or a small business SBIR grant is that patents are usually a pretty big deal in the SBIR funding phase. So if you're looking for phase 1 or phase 2 grants, a lot of times those reviewing committees are looking to see what your intellectual property portfolio looks like, and it can become a pretty big consideration for them. We can go to the next slide.
I just have a quick question
Yeah,
on the
sure.
SBIR.
Yeah.
That's actually the main reason I'm interested in patents. The NSF director essentially told me, hey, we would really like it if you would patent for
Right.
technology. But at the same time, we're a small company. We have a couple of physicians, neuroscientists. We won't be able to prosecute it. How do you, will the provisional patent work? Because
So yeah, we're a provisional patent, because a provisional patent application, it's not examined.
yes.
A lot of times I think that that's a good strategy to think about, because what you can do, you can file that non-provisional a lot more cost effective from a upfront cost,
Yes.
and then use that as part of your SBIR application, try to generate some sort of investment or revenue in order to be able to ultimately prosecute it later, because essentially that provisional gives you a year runway before you have to file your non-provisional, and I think that's a good strategy in that case.
Okay.
And so for everyone in the room, you should understand a little bit about timing strategy with patents. So we were just talking about a provisional patent is something you submit to the patent office and say, here it is, ignore it, I'm not going to look at it, no one's going to do anything. For 1 year, you have an ability to protect yourself to decide what you're going to do with it. Non-provisional is when you actually say, here's something I want the patent office to look at. Which sounds great. The patent office is not going to look at it for 2 years. That's just the timeline, the backlog they have right now.
And so further to that point, it's important to think about the way the timing works in your, when you have to spend money
Yes.
on the patents. And so if you're in a situation where you can control this to a certain extent, make sure that you file your provisional at the right time, know when the expenses are going to hit down the line, and you can budget for it, and make sure you plan it out. Because I've seen situations where, like in the university licensing context, people drag out their negotiations, and all of a sudden it comes time to file a PCT application or a national something. There's a huge office action expense coming up. If they would have been more prudent about the way that they were negotiating a license, they would have gotten a license out. They would have been able to start working, maybe potentially get investment or revenue before that hits, and knowing what that runway looks like and what the expense is going to be like over time can be a key consideration in either going to get SBIR funding or other kinds of revenue.
So when a company or individual files a patent application and is received and accepted by the patent office, at that moment, does the time tick down to that 20-year period of protection? You said 2 years it could take,
So,
and there may be...
right, so in Sree's timeline, if you file a provisional patent application, that's essentially all it is a placeholder. It doesn't get examined, but it gives you a filing date. You have a year to file a non-provisional application, and so if you convert it, your filing date starts in year 1, or day 0, and starts 20 years from there. If you file a non-provisional application that claims priority back to that first one, you can get your day 0 to start later. And
But
that's,
going
that's
to
a
the
whole
question, I think you were also asking.
But essentially, yes. I mean,
if I go through 2 years of appeals and it gets rejected and I have to appeal,
yeah, there's
that's time off the 20 years.
It is. Depending on what on what's happening, there can be a patent term adjustment, and that's.
But yes, you are losing time as you go through prosecution. So there might be some adjustment. It's never going to get you the full, more than likely will never get you the full 20 years from when it issues.
One would think once it's approved, then it
No.
begins, but
No,
the reality
but
is...
today for utility patents, it starts when you're filing.
Okay, understood.
And so again, going back to the strategy, think through strategically when the money is going to be due, when the prosecution is going to happen,
And it can also be a reason, getting into like some more advanced patent prosecution strategies, it can be a reason to, if you're getting rejected on some of your claims, and not all of them, take your narrower claims that are an issue and let them issue. And get that out there so you have a longer window on them, and then you might file a continuation and keep fighting on the other ones, but to make sure that you still have time on what you have. Another thing that comes up in financing organizations, and is something that happens more for mature companies or later stage startups, is that you can actually use patents as loan collateral. Because patents have the attributes of personal property, place liens against them, and there are banks that will actually lend money to your startup using your loans to back them. There's strong bankruptcy protection lessons in this running to patent companies. You can get better interest rates, and studies have actually shown a correlation between patents, pledges, collateral, and increases in R&D expenditures for the companies.
So there's even $1 billion fund in Boston. That's all they do, is they lend on patents as collateral, and then their loan has an interest rate, and if the defaults, they will take the patent, monetize the patent, and if once they get their money back, give the patent back to the company. So there are businesses that are built upon this.
Yeah, and so I think the next set of slides, it shows that this has actually been something that's been growing over the last 30 years or so, and it's been across various industries. You can also use field of use licensing to other markets as a way of generating income alongside of your technology. So if you have a set of patent applications or issued patents that could be applied to multiple domains and you're not building in that space, you can license out into different fields of use so that your company can generate revenue alongside. Again,
so here's a little bit of we'll take a quick second break to just explain what a patent is in some sense, is that a patent is a US patent is the ability to exclude people from doing something within the continental or in the United States. Let's assume geographically you don't care about Utah. You can allow someone to do that in Utah. So your patent is actually a huge stick of lots of different rights. It's also the ability to stop people from using your technology in any field that it would be applicable to. So let's assume that you have a medical device, but the same technology could be applied to agriculture. And you say, that's great, I don't care about agriculture. You could license out the ability to use it in the ag tech market while maintaining the right to exclusively use it in the med tech market. So it's a lot of different rights all bundled into one. And so understanding, again, I go back to understanding strategically how to use those rights, how to divide those rights, what makes the most sense for your company allows you the most leverage on what you're going to do with your patent.
And so you can also, this being Carnegie Mellon, and us being quantitatively oriented, you can use data to decide whether patents can drive value to you. So part of it is you can try to understand how your venture capitalists actually value your IP. Again, who are the most active investors for companies like yours? Think of companies that they're investing in and what their portfolios look like. So how often do they file patent applications? Do the valuations that these companies get differ based on either having patents or not, or the valuation on those patent portfolios based on size? And there are databases out there where if you have patent counsel, you can probably work with them to get information like this and figure out what the data in order to be able to drive decisions as to whether or not it makes sense for you to.
This also drives your story. So for example, Jason and I often talk to some companies and we talk to them about building a single patent that has a lot of different inventions in it. And that's great initially, but let's say a VC is more interested in number of patents. That's what they care about. How do you drive your story? You can easily go to your patent counsel and say, I need 15, 20, 100 different claim sets. Here's all the different ways, all the different types of patents we can get out of this one asset. Can you just give me the claim set so I can take that to the VC and say, I have one patent, but I can file 100 different continuations that cover all of these different areas, that create thickets in these key industries. That's the value of my company because that's what they understand. using the data to understand what the VCs value, and then turning your story around based on that value is really fundamentally what patents allow you to do.
Yeah, and again, there's no single best strategy. What the strategy for your company should be, or your research project in a lab, or really anything else that you're building. Again, make sure that the IP that you're building, the patents that you're going out and getting, or the trade secrets that you're trying to protect, that it really does build and drive value for your business. And again, we really think that when your business strategy is aligned with your IP and patenting strategy, that's where you're going to see the most synergies to drive enterprise value for what you're working with.
And it's when you violate this, when your patent strategy is driven independently of your business strategy, that the patents suddenly can become concrete shoes that drag down the business rather than assets that really build up the business.
So our contact information's here. We'll stick around if anybody has any questions now. Glad to answer more, or if you'd rather come up and talk to us afterwards, we'd love to talk.
Any questions? Thank you very
All
much.
right, thanks for coming out today.
So,